We often sit in the past, restrained by regrets, buried in guilt, and unable to move on. While apologies can't change the past, they are the mark of a promise for a different future, a brighter future that isn't suffocated by the past. We have come to an interesting point in time in the One Piece world where the present is meeting the past. It seems like the sins of the past are bubbling up and the weight of the history is starting to be unpacked. The difficult part is we are missing the piece of history that seems to carry the most weight. How are you supposed to know what to do with a package if you don't know what's inside? The world government does not want us to look inside, but they're unable to hide everything. And maybe we can figure out some of that history by the ones who actually carried that history. And in this video, we're going to take a quick look at some interesting possibilities and how the legendary Iron Giant fits in that history. Imagine waking up after 800 years and your first words are an apology. The literal irony of a cold, metallic, immortalized legend that awakens and demonstrates an emotion so human that most of us can comprehend how painful it must be to wake up with so much regret that we feel the need to apologize immediately. And so let's talk about how the legendary Iron Giant will change the future of One Piece. And I think Oda might have given us enough fuel to light up the world of One Piece and finally understand everything that we've been in the dark about. And if you're new to the channel, the way I view the world is by making connections. So let me connect you to my vision, the Parvision. In order to understand what might happen in the future, in this case, I think it would make sense for us to look into some of the parallel instances of the present as a viewfinder for what might have transpired in the past. And since we are talking about apologies, let's start with Joy Boy's apology to Fishman Island. It is said that at least 800 years ago, Joy Boy was a person who lived on the surface during the Void Century. He sent a message meant for the mermaid princess on the island at the time, and it was an apology for breaking a promise made with Fishman Island. The contents of the promise aren't clear, but someone was supposed to come along fulfilling the promise in Joy Boy's stead, which is why they have protected the Noah for generations because of the royal legend that had been passed down. So to give some of this context, Nefertari D. Lily apparently was involved with spreading the poneglyphs all over the world. This was part of her great mistake 800 years ago. On top of that, the Kozuki were the ones to engrave the poneglyphs, and this message was sent from Joy Boy to the mermaid princess, who is presumably the previous Poseidon. So already we have 4 separate significant entities working in a group, but in the conversation between Robin and King Neptune, we get an interesting conjecture. Robin asks if Joy Boy was meant to use Noah, could he have had the power to control Neptunians, which is in reference to the fact that the Neptunians are the ones large enough to pull the Noah. But that's when King Neptune divulges that no, it wasn't Joy Boy who had this power, it was actually the previous Poseidon, who again was the mermaid princess. But isn't that interesting, because the Noah is protected by Fishman Island, and from what we understand, the mermaid princess received this message. Now we can't guarantee that the previous Poseidon actually got this message, but we do know that someone had to decipher the poneglyph just like Robin, and that would be how the royal legend was passed down, which is interesting because that would mean that someone was able to read the Kozuki secret glyph here, or at minimum, I think the simplest answer is that Poseidon was able to read it due to their association with Joy Boy, the Kozuki, and most likely the Ancient Kingdom. But the reason why this apology is a little more complicated is because if Fishman Island had the Noah and Poseidon, then they seemingly already had all the ingredients to use it. But Joy Boy would have provided something else? It said that Joy Boy would be able to guide Poseidon, but we see even a common mermaid like Kami is able to traverse the ocean and find the surface with relatively no difficulty. The same can be said about Fishman. So why couldn't Poseidon have used the Noah themselves? Even if we look at Shirahoshi's character arc, it was basically Luffy trying to instill the courage to act on her own accord. We see Shirahoshi overcoming her cowardness and attending the reverie to prove something to Luffy in spirit. So was it that the original Poseidon was also a coward? But if the original Poseidon went down in history as a coward, then how could they have left such a legend that puts them on the tier of an ancient weapon that has the power to sink the world? So again, what promise did Joy Boy make with Fishman Island where this would even make sense? If Luffy and Joy Boy are one and the same in spirit, then maybe it was the same promise that Luffy had about claiming Fishman Island as his territory. But another interesting thing with Luffy is that most of his promises entail defeating some oppressive force like Doflamingo, Crocodile, Moria, Kaido, Big Mom, etc. And Luffy would never lose without dying, basically. And so in that regard, if Luffy ever broke any of his promises, he would never have been able to make an apology or have some Kozuki clan member draft this message for him. I mean, think about it. When has Luffy ever had to apologize outside of his unserious moments and gags? But there actually was a really memorable moment, which was chapter 99 titled Luffy Died, which opens up with the line, "Legends that endure in the future were events that took place in the distant past." And later in the chapter, we see Luffy was on the execution stand with Buggy standing over him. And when we look back at the panels, it's an odd thing because from the moment Luffy was captured to the seconds before he was about to be executed, he never struggled. struggled. He never even tried to escape. It's not like there was any sea stone even mentioned, and I think we could all think of an infinite number of ways Luffy could have escaped this on his own. Instead, he apologized to Buggy and his last words were going to be, "Sorry, I'm a goner." So based on this context, is this the legend that transpired in the past? Joy Boy just relinquished his life and apologized to his friends for being a goner? It wasn't even in the hands of some great oppressive force, it was just a rival. Could it be said that Luffy gave up here? Luffy had great ambition. There was nothing in the story to indicate otherwise. He hadn't even begun to satisfy his dreams. But if Luffy had promised something to someone here, wouldn't he have fought back? I can't see Luffy giving up like this on Wano or anywhere else, but Luffy actually did promise something. It was to his crew, to the whole world that could hear him. Luffy promised to be the Pirate King. This was something whether or not his crew fully believed in just yet, it was something that each one of them eventually deferred their own dreams for, or rather attached their dreams to. So maybe this was much of the same context. The original Poseidon had a dream that was enabled by Joy Boy's dream. Not one and the same, but by Joy Boy failing his own dream, he was unable to keep his promise. And again, if we were to use a parallel here, let's not forget Luffy's promise to Shirahoshi. Shirahoshi asked Luffy to take her on a stroll again in the future when she isn't a coward. She wanted to be escorted to a real forest, which though she has now seen a forest in the Reverie, the reality was clarified that it wasn't a real forest and rather it was man-made. And so going back to Shirahoshi's request, Luffy responded, "Next time I see you, we'll take a trip." They shook on a promise, and that's where Nami and Brook chimed in. Nami asking what their responsibility would be if Luffy makes the promise, and Brook says that promises are to be kept to the death. And that's where all of the Straw Hats came together and all promised Shirahoshi the same thing. And Shirahoshi said, with this many promises, I'm sure it will be fulfilled. And that's where it gets interesting, because maybe the promise was this simple. Joy Boy apologized because he would never be able to see Poseidon again. It might be that the original Poseidon had the same desire, but maybe a little bit more specific. The thing that we do know, according to the Gorosei, is that in every era, the world government has attempted to recover the Gum Gum fruit, and not once has it ever succeeded for 800 years. Which could either mean that the world government had the Nika fruit before the 800 years, or the Nika fruit was created at the end of the Void Century. And we do know that whatever entity could be called Joy Boy is tied to the Nika fruit, because Zunisha confirmed that Luffy was Joy Boy, and that the last time he had heard the iconic Drums of Liberation had been 800 years ago. So maybe because of the creation of, or the passing on of Joy Boy's will through the Nika fruit is why he said to Poseidon that there will one day come someone to take his stead and bring about the promise. But if Joy Boy didn't immediately die and was able to apologize and possibly instigate his will's ability to pass on, then maybe something either prevented Joy Boy from being able to go down to the ocean floor to see Poseidon. The weakness to water, for example, that devil fruits have sounds kind of like it would fit here, but not entirely. But another option is that the thing that the original Poseidon wanted to see was no longer there. And this is where we split off into two directions. The first idea that I want to bring up, but may not entirely be relevant for this, would be Nolan's backstory. To summarize the relevance, Kalgara had promised to continue ringing the golden bell on Shandora so that Nolan would not lose his way to the island even in a storm. Nolan then promises to return and to meet again. And the reality had it that the knock-up stream intervened this faded friendship and broke the promise. And if you know my theory on the knock-up stream, then you know how I think it wasn't a coincidence that this happened in the first place. But check out that full video and let's keep it moving. After the knock-up stream, for the first time in Shandian's history, there was no one there to protect the bell, and a war had been waged over the land, which made it so Kalgara could not ring the bell. But also Nolan, who arrived to make good on his promise, was met with the absurd reality that his friend's land was just gone. And to cope with this reality, he had theorized that due to tectonic plate shifts of the Earth's crust, that the ancient ruins sank into the sea. And so if we were to take this idea and try to contextualize it to Joy Boy, then maybe something like Joy Boy had gone to Fishman Island and made a promise to meet again, and that's when the Void Century War had occurred. The place that Poseidon had asked to see was a place that Joy Boy can no longer bring the mermaid to. I've wondered if this had to do with the Red Line, because we do know the Lunarians used to be on top of the Red Line, but now they have switched to the Celestial Dragons, the current rulers of the world government. But another idea I had would be if for some reason Wano was the destination, because the Kozuki clan closed the borders. If Joy Boy were to arrive there instead of seeing a town, he would be met with a wall that scaled to the sky. At the time, there would be no waterfall most likely, and we don't know how Mogura Port works, which would be the other way to the top of the island. And I only bring up these options because there's many options that someone could think about, but let me share the other context I thought about regarding Joy Boy's promise. It connects to Wano in that it has to do with Kozuki's closing the border. Oden gives us another possible context for this situation in that if you remember the golden hour, I think this might be the closest context we have to compare to Joy Boy, in that Oden was put into a perilous situation after returning home after his desired journey. He found his land was overtaken by a proxy ruler who was backed by by the power of a literal dragon, who is seen as the guardian of the land. And instead of a violent uprising, he tries to appease Kaido and Orochi in order to protect the lives of the hostages. Ultimately, Oden had to fight back, and after losing, before his execution, he was able to foresee his own death. Before dying, he gave a message to Toki, saying that if he were to fail, then they would need to wait 20 years for a war terrible enough to split the seas. And this message could resemble the same one that Joy Boy imparted to the previous Poseidon, telling them to wait for the next person to carry his will. And that's the other important thing. Oden decided to barter his life for his allies' lives. Oden decided to shoulder the sin, literally carried his allies on his shoulders while imparting his desire, which the allies then decide to shoulder for Oden, and that was for the Scabbards to open up Wano in his stead. And the Scabbards all agreed, and that was the story we followed for most of the time skip. And so to quickly contextualize a version of Joy Boy here, it could be that like Oden, Joy Boy went on a journey leaving his homeland despite having the responsibility to rule, like Oden would have, not knowing his father would pass away. When Joy Boy returned, he found a proxy leader like Orochi that was backed by a celestial dragon, who would be regarded as the creator of lands just like Kaido was for Wano. Joy Boy tried to appease this ruler during the Void Century instead of directly fighting, which would be the 5 years that Oden stalled for, but everything came down to a full-on fight just like Oden versus Kaido. And after Joy Boy was defeated, that's when we would have been able to prepare this message that parallels Oden's, but instead of saying 20 years, he would say 800 years. And when it came time for his execution, Joy Boy took on the sin of his collaborators or his crew, thus freeing them just like the Scabbards. And it seems like we've been slowly meeting some of Joy Boy's allies, but something to consider is that the Scabbards weren't tasked with directly opening up Wano, but rather to prepare the country and work with the eventual Joy Boy. And remember how Luffy made the promise to Shirahoshi, but not just him, his entire crew made the same promise. It's likely that Joy Boy's apology to the original Poseidon was a group apology, because remember, Kozuki must have written it and Lily delivered it, and I'm sure we'll start to learn more and more connections to this moment, like maybe Zunisha's involvement here too. And that's when we have to acknowledge one more entity that is a part of the promise, which is the Noah itself. Seeing Luffy now embodying Nika and Joy Boy, I haven't gotten the vibe that he was all of a sudden a shipwright, and the obvious connection is that Joy Boy's shipwright probably created this, and we do know of the ancient shipwright guild that built Pluton that existed. Could it make sense that Joy Boy's shipwright was once part of the ancient guild like Galila and Tom's shipwright group, and thereafter left to join Joy Boy, which would make this character similar to Frankie in a lot of ways. We might even have the nickname because the Noah is an obvious reference to Noah's Ark, and in all of the iterations, Noah built the Ark, which has a pretty similar theoretical design to the one in One Piece, but the caveat of this detail is that this would technically make Noah canonically a shipwright in the religious text referencing this story, and so it's likely that Noah was Joy Boy's shipwright. And now for the jump to the entire point of the video that will explode into a flood of connections. It's likely that the legendary Iron Giant is Noah, the legendary shipwright from Joy Boy's crew that would essentially parallel Frankie amongst a few others. One of the main reasons this makes sense to me is because from what we can gather about Joy Boy is that he was not living in his best timeline. If anything, it sounds like Luffy is living the right timeline, and this would essentially be the case for all of the allies. If Luffy fails, the Straw Hats wouldn't be in their best timeline in general. Another example for this is Oden's Scabbards. After Oden failed, Shinobu seemingly went in a different direction than her best potential, but the main example would be Denjiro, who was overtaken by anger, so much so that his face became disfigured. But we also see good and bad timelines for the Straw Hats, and the one I'd want to point to is Frankie, who in a bad timeline at 40 years old became a fully mechanical looking robot, as if the General Frankie was not an extension but just his body, and if he kept moving in this direction, then he would become a battleship. But if you were to imagine a Void Century version of Frankie following a bad timeline, then it's possible that they too ended up as a giant robot, one that is filled with so much regret that they wake up and immediately apologize, one that autopilots to seemingly take revenge or rectify the past by running straight to Mary Joie. And if we think about it too, then this legendary Iron Giant was said to have been built 900 years ago, which is just before the Void Century started. It could be that when the Iron Giant apologized, it was because he was partially responsible for what started the Void Century. And if we are saying that this Iron Giant was Noah, who built Noah's Ark, a legendary shipwright, and he was a part of the ancient shipwright guild or even its creator, then the blueprints that the modern legendary shipwright Tom had for Pluton would have been developed by him, meaning this Iron Giant could be responsible for the ancient weapon Pluton that is asleep on Wano. I'd question maybe this giant was Pluton itself, but since Frankie looked at it and it didn't garner any kind of reaction that would be warranted for the existence of Pluton, I think we can dismiss this from being Pluton, but could explain Frankie's reaction to Pluton's blueprint when he said, "Can humans really build this thing?" Which this thing clearly is not human. But that's where we hit another obvious irony, in that it is kind of human. Apologizing is very human, at least, or having the ability to. And we have one more context that Oda gave us recently that might be the most crucial to include, and that is Kuma. Our beloved best dad in the series might be one of the best humans in the story to exist, and yet right now he is nothing but a robot, a lifeless one at that. In fact, right now Kuma is in a state of lifelessness that is inconceivable to Vegapunk. He says there's no reason he should have sprung into motion, and that he should be in a total vegetative state without the ability to act of his own free will or carry out orders, which seems to be the case for the legendary Iron Giant. And if we were to retrace the steps, both Kuma and the Iron Giant sprung into action randomly and seemingly attacked Mare Joie. Kuma ended up there and was in a manner trying to make it through as a pit stop, but still was seen as an attack of the Holy Land. This is nearly mirrored by the Iron Giant, except the Iron Giant lost power during the attack. Keep in mind, Vegapunk does not know what is powering Kuma, and similarly cannot figure out what is powering the legendary Iron Giant, despite trying to reverse engineer it entirely. And maybe the parallels don't stop there. In a lot of ways, Frankie in a bad timeline would be on the path towards becoming Kuma on his own. And though Kuma relinquished the majority of his humanity, it was in sacrifice to his daughter. Maybe there was some mixture of this in the Void Century for the legendary shipwright of the past. If we think about Tom's story, he was also in a similar situation as Kuma, where he essentially had to sell his soul a little bit for a crime, and he was working with the world government to create the Seed Train. The world government wanted this so badly that they were willing to overlook all the crimes that he had been convicted of. Now, the reason I said he sold his soul a little bit was because this was Tom's dream ship, and this alliance with the world government was something that Iceberg had to do as well so that he could be protected, and thus the blueprints and the city could be too. So Frankie knows a lot about having this perspective, which is where characters like Vegapunk comes in, who had to do something similar to Iceberg, and Kuma, who had to do something similar to Tom. Tom took a death sentence to save Frankie, and Kuma took a death sentence to save Bonnie. And I think one last crucial thing to do is to look at both of those deaths. The first one might be a stretch, but the appearance of the legendary Iron Giant always struck a chord with me. I never could place my finger on it until this video, and it was that it looks like the legendary Iron Giant was struck with a pole arm in the torso. And when I revisited Tom's flashback, we see the same thing. He was struck with a pole arm as well, but even used it as a weapon, which the Iron Giant seemed to do also. If it turns out that this Iron Giant was a shipwright of the Void Century, then easily this would become an iconic parallel that Oda made. But in both cases, the pole arm was just a slight annoyance for the giant figures who had a greater goal in mind. Tom used his last breath to make sure that his successors could live freely and was content with his dream ship setting sail. It was an act to protect. And speaking of the act of protecting, I want to go to the second idea that circles back to Kuma and the Iron Giant. If we can see the obvious parallels in their lifelessness and even their paths during that lifelessness, then maybe Kuma's last conscious act is the same mission that the legendary Iron Giant had. Now, this is one of those big mysteries that's hidden in the background of Egghead. We have no idea where the Iron Giant even originated from, but from the Kuma parallel, maybe we can figure it out. 200 years ago, it just showed up out of nowhere. The only thing we know about 200 years ago is that the ship from St. Brice went to the Sky Island around that time, and that Fishman discrimination became a huge issue. But also Ryugu Kingdom joined the world government. So all we know is where it ended up, and by the way the story was told, it was that the world government ordered it to be torn down and destroyed. But the scientists' curiosity prevented them from carrying out that order, so it rests on Egghead. But apparently the world government had no idea it was even on Egghead. We also don't know how it got to Egghead, because how would they even have moved this? But if we were to back up a bit, Kuma was given the order by the world government to be given a self-destruct switch just in case he defected and switched sides. Vegapunk, the scientist in charge, could not comply and instead put a shutdown switch that did not account for the supernatural aspects of Kuma that allows him to attack the world government despite being an agent of the world government. This seems to fit the legendary Iron Giant in that the scientists also did not want to destroy the giant. But what if the reason for the self-destruct order was because of the precedent that this Iron Giant gave them? The giant originally being an ally of Joy Boy, but like Kuma became an agent of the world government. It could fit really well here. The reason I think that the legendary Iron Giant could have had a very similar path as Kuma is that the Pacifista project was supposed to make Kuma into one of the greatest soldiers that uphold justice for the Navy. The Pacifista name comes from Kuma being a pacifist by nature, and the natural pacifism to me is a direct ode to the Iron Giant movie, where the Iron Giant was a giant robot who was a pacifist. And similarly, I think that the legendary Iron Giant in One Piece could have been used like this in the Void Century by the world government, and the reason I say that is because of Sora, the hero of the Marines, the warrior of the sea, the propaganda story that is said to have had certain truths, and one of them might be the part of Sora's ally, which was the dreamy giant robot. And again, if the parallel fits between Kuma and the Iron Giant, then it could be that the Iron Giant from this story was a replica or a copy of the original, like how the Pacifistas are replicas of the original Kuma, which then fits the same aspect of the Gorosei wanting a self-destruct for Kuma because they had experienced the legendary Iron Giant raid on Marijois 200 years prior, and it could fit the very same order to dismantle and destroy it, but the scientists not wanting to. But all of this aside, getting back to the core theory, when you think about it, Kuma's true loyalty lies with two people. It's Bonnie and Joy Boy, which might be the case for the legendary Iron Giant, who clearly has a tie to Joy Boy, and that's where the other allegiance becomes very interesting. But you might already surmise where I'm going with this. But I derailed a little bit talking about the Kuma connection so deeply. If you remember, Kuma's fate had always been perilous in our timeline, but I think his last act might have been one of the most profound choices he could have demonstrated, and in his last walk, he visited Bonnie from afar, but he also saved all of the Straw Hats from utter destruction. It was too early for the Straw Hats to make their moves, but not only did he do that, the thing that put all the Straw Hats in permanent debt to Kuma was during the 2-year time skip. Kuma watched over the Thousand Sunny and fought endlessly to defend the Straw Hats ship. His final mission was to stand guard of Joy Boy's ship of promise. This was the ship that all the Straw Hats, after being separated, said that they would return to after 2 years instead of 3 days. And what if, just like Luffy changed the time of their reunion and Toki told Wano to wait 20 years because of Odin's prophecy, that Joy Boy told his allies to wait until his return for 800 years. In every story, there was someone who made an ultimate sacrifice against all the odds. For Luffy, Kuma was that person. In Wano, there were several people, but people like Denjiro and Yasue come to mind. And it might be that for Joy Boy, the legendary Iron Giant was waiting at the ship of promise, the Noah. Yes, I think it would all make sense if the legendary Iron Giant was standing guard of the ship of promise, the place where Joy Boy said he would eventually return to. Joy Boy prophesied this day and told the previous Poseidon of this promise to return here to use the Noah. And we know that the whole world was waiting for the eventual return of Joy Boy, but they didn't get an apology, they didn't get a message, and there wasn't any indication of the sort. And an example of this would be Wano. From the entire story so far, we know that Joy Boy has to visit two places, Wano and Fishman Island. But the difference is that the reason why we know Wano is a destination of importance is because Odin saw the true history at Laugh Hill, whereas Fishman Island was told directly that Joy Boy will return here to guide Poseidon by Joy Boy himself. There's no other place like that. So the rest of the world is waiting for the dawn, and we're told various ways that they could help, but Fishman Island has to be pivotal toward that dawn coming. If you remember from chapter 621, King Neptune saying that he could not stop Otahime for putting herself in such a reckless and dangerous position, because the world Otahime dreams of is exactly like the one our forebears sought to create centuries ago. She is trying to achieve what they did. The important line was that they achieved it. All Otahime wanted was to bring everyone to the surface. If the dream was to be on the surface and the Noah was the ship of promise, then I can see a world where the legendary Iron Giant was here, protecting Joy Boy's home. Because again, that's what Kuma did for Joy Boy. Luffy had no knowledge of Kuma doing this, but Kuma, being such a devout supporter, took it upon himself to do this. And similarly, I think the legendary Iron Giant story is going to be similar to Kuma even in this regard, essentially holding guard until Joy Boy returned. And when he eventually woke up in the presence of Joy Boy, he apologized. And I think it was because he left his post. And that's where it gets even more interesting, because if this was the same situation as Kuma, then Kuma also most likely would have broke his mission to protect the Sunny if Bonnie was at stake or the mission was at stake. Because remember, Kuma went haywire despite shutting down because of Bonnie, not because of Joy Boy. So what if that's the same case for the legendary Iron Giant, who had the mission to protect Joy Boy's home, but the instinct to protect something else? And if you were to go back 200 years ago, it might be that the legendary Iron Giant left his post because something important to the Iron Giant was threatened. And I have a few options or ideas for this. All of them revolve around that reverie that happened where Ryugu Kingdom signed the peace treaty. See, the thing that was emphasized was that they went to sign an agreement that recognized fishmen weren't just fish but equal to humans, but at the same time, fishman discrimination was really bad at the time, and it obviously continued into our current timeline. The reality is that Otahime was able to forge motion towards peace, but also the world government made Jinbei a warlord to enable better relations with the fishmen, something that they were upset about losing when Jinbei left the warlords. And despite 200 years passing and the issue being at the forefront of the Fishman experience, for humans nothing really changed, as we noticed that when Neptune came to the surface, Stelly spat out ignorant assumptions he had heard, and I'm not even sure where he heard it from. But also we saw later that the Celestial Dragons completely ignored Shirahoshi's status as a royal and an equal, and decided to try to subjugate her using none other than Kuma. Now I'm not sure what version of the current reverie could have been applied to the past reverie, but one thing we can acknowledge is that whatever happened 200 years ago, that was not only the first reverie that Ryugu Palace was a part of, but also the last. If things went well, then I would imagine this wouldn't be the case. So then what could have possibly have happened that allowed the fishmen to get peace, still be discriminated, and join the world government, all while involving the Iron Giant? And this all actually connects to one of my most underrated videos, my Otahime video. If you watch that video, you'll see how I painted how odd it was that Otahime was able to forge the peace treaty. But after a dissection of all the dialogue, we see that Otahime said it was the power of Poseidon that gave her courage to go to the surface, and said that the power of Poseidon would be of great help to her, and that the power of love can save thousands. Go check that video for the full context, but what applies here is that in order to forge peace, a forward envoy was needed, and at the minimum leverage, using the saved Celestial Dragon that Otahime escorted back to the surface. The entire kingdom was sleepless waiting for her return. She succeeded, and though their eventual return to the reverie was delayed due to her death, they eventually went. Now let's imagine a world where Otahime went to the surface and experienced something similar to what Shirahoshi did when she went to the reverie. I think this is what might have happened before at the reverie 200 years ago, because you have to recognize that 200 years ago when the fishmen forged that peace treaty, it wasn't like they decided to show up at the reverie while being oppressed, because remember, people consider them to be the same as fish. Imagine a fish just walking to the UN and claiming they were human and succeeding. I think what happened instead was there was a forward envoy like Otahime that existed in the past that did the same thing as Otahime without the power of Poseidon, but instead, the legendary Iron Giant showed up. Now, I could have ended this theory speculating who this Iron Giant was and stuck to the surface level stuff, but I think there's been too many times now, given the pacing of One Piece, that I restrained my theories only to find out that Oda took things to the next level anyways. And so regardless of whether I'm right here, the reason I extended this theory is because I love where this theory ends, because I think we have enough to know the power that fuels the Iron Giant. It's not even that convoluted, to be honest. When I say what it is, you'll understand why I made all of these connections to the legendary Iron Giant, to all of those other characters from Tom, Kuma, and Otahime, and so much more. There's a single thing that connects all of them, and it solves the mystery of how the Iron Giant moves. What we know is 200 years ago, it just got up, raided Mer Joie, then lost its power. And now it seems like when Luffy turns Gear 5 in Chapter 1092, Chapter 1106, and Chapter 1111, the giant got up and is fully sentient. It always seems like it's in line with the drums of liberation, but we didn't technically get the sound effects on the Chapter 1111 panel. Now let's recall that Vegapunk said that the part that he cannot recreate is its dynamic power source. The legendary Iron Giant is powered by something strong enough to rewrite everything we know about the world today. This is despite Vegapunk creating the Mother Flame from what we know is created from a power plant, but is significant enough to power something that could literally delete an island. So if Vegapunk has something like that and it still doesn't work, then there must be something else. But something that has been a reoccurring theme that's becoming more and more prevalent is the gap between science and reality. And actually, Vegapunk probably recently admitted to us what it was. See, Vegapunk has no idea what is powering Kuma also. From a scientific standpoint, everything about Kuma is illogical and unscientific, and yet Kuma is walking, moving, and he isn't talking, but he is breaking reality at the moment. Just like the legendary Iron Giant, it seems like Kuma is powered by some kind of dynamic power source, and they're probably powered by the same miracle. And remember what Edison's words were before he jumped. It was, wherever miracles occur, the power behind them is guts or perseverance. He was saying it was unscientific, but a lot of the science has been broken in Egghead. Like Sanji, who has multiple times now said something along the lines that love is stronger than light, and defied Kizaru's understanding of reality. The power of love is most likely the primary driver or majority factor to what Vegapunk refers to as the dynamic power source. To be clear, by love, I mean in the more general sense, a sense of desire, something that brings about joy or evoking passion. It's honestly hard to describe, but it's whatever you'd put under the umbrella of the cross-section of Sanji and Kuma. The emotion that drives us to want to protect something, whether it be a person or a dream. When you look at Sanji's depiction of passion and love, he becomes emblazoned at the opportunity to protect women. He'll even light on fire sometimes or show incredible durability. He'll sacrifice himself, and it's something that even Robin said, if he senses danger to his loved ones, he'll be there in a heartbeat. And when you think about it, that describes Kuma's situation as well. If we go back to chapter 1067, right after we see Shaka mention the dynamic power source, we see Bonnie, who is passed out because she feared for her life. And that same chapter is when we see Kuma get up. This is when he starts defying logic, breaking his chains, overcoming his programming, and starts to go towards Bonnie. It was in line with Bonnie being threatened. To parallel it with Sanji, Kuma's love singularly focuses on Bonnie. And just like Sanji would proclaim that no matter where in the world Nami or Robin is, for example, he would be there. Obviously with the limitations that Kuma does not have. Remember in chapter 1097 when Kuma told Jinny that no matter where she is, he would be there immediately. And this love, this desire to protect or to give another perspective, despite all the trauma Kuma had experienced in his life, he held it together. But losing Jinny sent Kuma into a reckless spiral. The same spiral that applies to Bonnie, because as we know, Kuma would literally search the world and back for Bonnie, and even sacrifice his body for her. Which remember, I mentioned Tom. In the moments when Tom most resembled the legendary Iron Giant, through the fire and the tranquilizer bullets, he only passed out after he sacrificed himself for Frankie and Iceberg's safety. But again, in Kuma's situation, we know the distance Kuma traveled. We know the lengths he went. In the vegetative state, he still mustered up Haki and took down a celestial dragon. It was only when he secured Bonnie that he powered down. And that was the miracle that Vegapunk could not calculate for. Whatever powered Kuma is most likely the ancient power source that Vegapunk is inching towards. And it kind of makes sense if the power source he created is called Mother Flame. The flame in this case would be signifying the love and passion that we just described of Sanji, and the mother aspect being the protective nature that Kuma was able to embody. It might be that the Mother Flame is an undying flame, like Lilith said, that actually doesn't burn. Kind of like how Marco's flames don't hurt people, they heal. And just to add on something is that the other aspect that Vegapunk has proclaimed that he could not figure out is removing the instincts of living creatures, which seems to be driving Kuma. And just like a shark's instinct is to eat, a mother's instinct would be to protect. And I don't think anyone would disagree that one of the most gripping parts of Kuma's existence was his ability to embody a mother. And that is where we land on the connection to the legendary Iron Giant. The embodiment of love is what I think moved the Iron Giant. And that's why I think a version of Otahime existed 200 years ago. It was through Otahime's efforts that Ryugu Kingdom made the movement towards the sun and surface again. And the first to do it was someone 200 years ago. And do you remember what Otahime was known as? She was the embodiment of love. This was the case through her entire character arc. She was remembered as someone who endured the pains of the present to make a better future. Just like Kuma, just like Tom, just like Odin. They all sacrificed themselves for the sake of a future they would would never see. Otahime had a natural color of observation haki power that allowed her to use her voice to touch people's hearts and even change them. Otahime was driven and struggled every day of her life fighting for that future, a promise she had made with her children to her death. To see the real sun was the dream. And that is when you sit back and circle all the way back to our conversation about the promise Joy Boy had with the original Poseidon. That's most likely the same as the one Luffy had with Shirahoshi. And in Otahime's case, remember what King Neptune said. The world Otahime dreams of is exactly like the one our forebears sought to create centuries ago. She is trying to achieve what they did. And Queen Otahime carried this dream with so much love, she moved an entire nation. She made some of her disbelievers passive. People who disagreed with her, like Fisher Tiger, in death realized she was right, despite it going against the core of his soul. He could not find a way to love humans against all the pain they had caused him. To want love and unity when you are oppressed is something most people could never even relate to, but is exactly why a character like Kuma made us all fall in love. He embodied this. Some of the most moving characters in One Piece embodied this. And so what I think happened 200 years ago was there existed a person with the same will as Otahime. Whether it had been the queen or king or simply a citizen, I think there existed someone who spoke to the legendary Iron Giant while it was guarding the Noah. And this person was basically identical to Otahime in that they embodied love and carried the dreams that the forebearers sought to create centuries ago. And if we are at all close to correct, this legendary Iron Giant was probably one of the forebearers who pushed the dream, who heard the ramblings of a naive, relatively fragile existence spout the same dreams as Joy Boy or Poseidon and light up. Like how Shanks and Rayleigh did when they experienced Luffy for the first time, or Zunisha when he heard Joy Boy's drums of liberations. I think someone from Ryugu Kingdom was able to awaken the legendary Iron Giant by outputting the power of love that Otahime admitted, the kind that set Sanji on fire, the kind of motherly love that made Kuma invincible, the same power that moved Kuma to the Red Line. I think that this mystery figure went to Meridjoa 200 years ago under some circumstance to fight for the rights of fishmen to be considered human, and when there, she most likely was targeted just like Shirahoshi, and when she cried or was attacked, that's when the legendary Iron Giant left his post guarding the Noah. And after securing this lovely queen and ensuring her safety, that's most likely when it powered down. I did consider that the opposite could be true and she died, which after losing the source of love that it sensed, that's when it all ended. And I think this could make sense and perfectly blend the elements that have all been tied or related to the giant robot. This would explain why, though a great motion in Fishman rights was made, it was essentially a non-starter because not only did Fishman continue to be persecuted, but Ryugu Kingdom never attended another reverie, which would have been the case in modern times had it not been for the undying flame of love that Otahime set forth. Remember who saved Shirahoshi and Neptune? It was none other than Saint Mosgard, who said, 10 long years ago, it was the speech of the late Queen Otahime that gave me my humanity. Otahime died, but the effect of her fire literally blessed this man. It was contagious, just like Roger's fiery will. And get this, remember that notion of sacrifice? This act that Mosgard committed resulted in his death. He gave his power to Neptune and was literally crucified for it. And the key word was humanity. Remember the discussion of Kuma and the Iron Giant regarding their state? Are they lifeless robots? I think Kuma has proved that there is more to humanity than circuits in the brain. And now that we know that the Iron Giant is sentient, the word human feels applicable. And I said the Iron Giant not only showed an ability to think, it showed remorse, regret, and apologized. Something most humans are capable of, but never do. Since we know love is what is moving Kuma, I think it's apt to say that this is what's moving the Iron Giant as well. But more than that, it's their humanity. The humanity that they retained at least. And there is one more cyborg we talked about that defied science, and that would be Sanji. Remember how his mom, Sora, sacrificed herself for the sake of her children? Judge removed some of the most human aspects from the brothers, but not Sanji. As Reiju said, the fact is, Sanji, you did grow as a human being. Mother gave her life in resistance to protect you and the emotions you were born with. That's what you stand for, Sanji. It's why you were born kinder and gentler than anyone. Out of context though, isn't that a really good description of Kuma? A human being who is born kinder and gentler than anyone? And remember, Sanji had the choice. Does he turn into a heartless robot like what Kuma ended up being, or accept his emotions? And he chose his emotions, and when he did that, he was able to conjure the hottest blue flame he's ever done. If love were the uncalculated dynamic power that Vegapunk could not figure out, then I think Judge also would not be able to calculate for this. And if it had to do with the fire of humanity, then this single realization solves so many voids in our understanding of the One Piece world. Let's start the cascade of realizations here. If the dynamic ancient power source is love, then we can take what Lilith said in chapter 1065 and recognize that this island's power source being fire, and that fire can be converted into all types of energy, then the reverse must also be true. Lilith says, I thought if only there was such a thing as an undying flame, we could create our own sun. And I want you to hold on to this statement, because then the mother flame that Vegapunk is making is a lesser form of what the legendary Iron Giant has or needs. If the legendary Iron Giant uses love as the fuel for its fire that powers it, then that means, according to my theory, that Kuma has the same thing. And if we plug that in with this panel, it is not the physical strength of the Buccaneers that makes them remarkable, for at one time and it cuts off. But the thing is, Vegapunk earlier seemed to lead us to believe that even before meeting Kuma, he already knew something about what was unique about Kuma's blood. And if I'm saying Kuma has the fire that the legendary Iron Giant has, then the answer to what makes Buccaneers special is that they have a diluted but larger capacity for the dynamic fire of the ancient kingdom. And what I'm thinking is that their larger chests and torsos are housing a larger flame. It's not the physical strength that enables their durability, it's given to them by the fire within them. And I think this might apply to all of One Piece. This is going to sound like a tangent, but stick with me. We talked a lot about the story of Noah, and I left out a huge reason why it works for the story of One Piece. It's that Noah was the 10th generation descendant of Adam and Eve. Noah was said to be 950 years old. Yes, the legendary Iron Giant would be technically 924 years old in the One Piece world. To give some interesting context, the flood happened when Noah was 600 years old, which some of this could apply to the One Piece world, but the concept that I want to bring your attention to was something that the Bible and Quran seem to agree on. And specifically in the Bible, it was that the maximum human lifespan was originally 1,000 years old, which explains Noah. And then as time goes on, human life reaches our mortal level, putting Moses at 120 years old maximum. And so if we were to apply this to the One Piece world, what we notice is that as far as races go, the longer lived giants are much bigger. And it's likely that the ancient giants have a longer lifespan. And I think just like the Abrahamic religious context, the fire continuously dwindles in size until you get to a human minimum that fits our reality, or the One Piece reality. But more specifically in the One Piece world, I think the variance of character sizes for humans changes how much fire they can withstand within them, which gives us the larger than life characters like Garp and the Admirals, but also Whitebeard, characters who have demonstrated so much power that it's almost inhuman. But then you have someone like Kureha, who has lived beyond the limits, and I have multiple explanations for what this means for her, but just trust me that I have a lengthy explanation for this so I can move on. My thought is that everyone has this fire within them, and humans are probably the weakest users of the fire. It's why when Usopp used his observation haki for the first time, we were shown these bright lights and ultimately a fiery spirit. The interesting part is that we can fully contextualize this and measure this. See, the fun part is that fire has weight. Yeah, it kind of doesn't make sense, but it can be weighed based on density. And remember what Vegapunk said? From a scholar in the West Blue, we know that in the One Piece world, people lose 21 grams of weight after they die. In other words, when someone dies, it's fire that leaves their body, and the weight of the human soul depended on the density of air in the One Piece world, and the size of the fire would essentially determine the volume of its vessel. But we've actually seen this in action, specifically when an incredibly strong soul is present and is purged from a body, a fire was shown. The strong soul was that of the sword god Ryuma, whose soul was probably so hot and close to the mythical level that it burned blue after Zoro released it. And remember how I mentioned that Kureha probably uses the fire differently? If I'm correct, then the fire that the legendary Iron Giant uses is probably similar to what the Buccaneers have. And the other ancient race to think of is the Lunarians, who have an undying fire on their back. When they turn on their fire, maybe instead of looking at it like an on-off switch, it's that they bring the fire outside of their body. They are a race that, unlike the Buccaneers, were able to change how they use the fire, and it manifested it in the durability that can easily be seen as the top of the verse. If we were to say that Kuma is emotionally tough, then King is physically tough, and it's all aided by that mother flame that I think is inside these ancient races, and all races to be honest. It might be that the minks have a different form that I don't want to dive into right now, and it's probably the same case with the fishmen. My thoughts are that all humans or living things have this fire, and now we can surmise that Brook's soul form, being a fire, was basically foreshadowing that the soul is just fire. The undying flame is the soul. When Ryuma's soul was liberated, his soul burned blue, which could explain his legendary status. And remember, he became a sword god. Let's not forget Hyogoro. In chapter 1006, he was shivering with excitement. He says, "It's so cold, but I've always had a strong grip on my mind." It seems that accidentally coming into contact with the Ice Oni virus has extracted all the strength I have to the very limit of my life. It may be burning the last remnants of my body for fuel. All energy can be turned into flames. Remember that? In this moment, he was using holy rage and his fire burned blue. When Sanji used Ifrit, he had rage. When Hyogoro mustered up his prime form to defend against the Ice Oni virus, it was likely that this was his internal soul, the last of his life. And then we see Marco's fire, the mythical phoenix that achieved a durability beyond Lunarians, which involved a Logia-like survivability and regeneration. This phoenix reached the peak potential of its life form and displayed this golden blue fire. And all of this should be a clue as to the visual of what the undying flame of the ancient kingdom was. If you enjoyed this video so far, please consider sharing this video, commenting, liking, subscribing. It's been tough recently for me to be able to put out the videos, but One Piece actually strengthens my inner fire that keeps me going, and I hope this has been fuel for yours. Before I explain how Oda actually showed us the ultimate flame already, I want to say that afterwards I'm going to keep connecting dots, so stick around. But I'm too excited to wait and give you the punchline at the end, so let's just get into this. So the clue was actually Hyogoro and Marco. They are the reason we know what the Ancient Kingdom's dynamic power source was, and this again will be the same power that the legendary Iron Giant uses. See, if a blue or really hot fire starts burning really efficiently, it changes color. The reality was that Lilith said that the undying flame would be the sun, and we know that the sun is white. And if we look at why Luffy is the sun god, it's because of his hair. Yes, the reason why Luffy is a mythical human, it's because he has found the pinnacle of his inner flame. This fiery white hair is Luffy's flame and a depiction of what the dynamic power source of the ancient kingdom looked like. We've even seen Luffy's black hair become fiery in his Gear 4 forms, and in a weird fiery red form at the beginning of Egghead, which makes it interesting because we don't technically know what King was doing with his head in his pterodactyl form, but since he has his flame on the outside like Nika, it's likely that his stretchy ability is similar to Nika's. I'm not going to go further on that line of logic, but now it could make sense that the reason why the legendary Iron Giant took so long to power up, it's because it was essentially charging from Luffy's fire. As the sun god, he is able to disseminate the energy freely. This is the abundant energy that exists everywhere, that Vegapunk is trying to understand and harness. And now we can understand one of the most cracked abilities that we never fully realized until now, which is the true strength of Luffy's stretchy ability. This also connects to Tom, by the way, so buckle in. Remember how I said that the size of the fire is likely dependent on the density of the air and the volume of the body? Well, Luffy can manipulate the volume of his body pretty easily, but he has actually been manipulating the density of the air too. One of the mysterious things is why Luffy has to blow into his fist to achieve Gear 3. It's obvious that he can't actually blow up his bones, but that's not what's happening here. What's happening is that Luffy is making the air in his body denser, thus expanding the fire, thus increasing the volume of his body. The steam that Luffy has could be explained by this. Not to mention that all the awakenings have the smoke clouds. It's symbolizing that internal fire burning. I'll explain that fully another time because this might explain black fiery clouds versus white ones. But going back to Luffy, normally if someone were to do what Luffy were doing and try to force increase their fire, they wouldn't be able to because their bodies aren't stretchy. And this could explain why Gear 4 has a time limit and how Luffy gets the form in the first place. We see that when Luffy loses Gear 4, he exhales an immense amount of steamy air every time. It's likely that when he reaches the time limit, his fire burned out. By wrapping his body in Haki, he forces his body to maintain a temporarily changed volume size, and Luffy is actually burning a fire within him that's greater than his base form. Gear 4 Bounce Man would then be a replica of a Buccaneer, and Gear 4 Snake Man would be a Lunarian, which is why I was saying maybe this could explain the stretchy ability, because remember the bouncing that Luffy shows is not the same as rubber. Instead, Snake Man. It defies the logic of rubber to achieve it. And in this form, Luffy is not burning his fire efficiently, which is why he has to tap out alongside the Haki depletion. But Gear 5 is the depiction of what happens when someone finds the best way to burn their fire, hence the white form. Because we know that a white flame is achieved by burning efficiently. And this would also explain the recoil. When Luffy goes Gear 3 initially, remember he goes back to a kid form? Based on this explanation, it's because Luffy achieves this by expanding his body size to artificially empower his inner flame. In order to recover then so that the fire doesn't burn out, he goes into a chibi form to compensate the temporarily smaller fire. And similarly in Gear 5, since his body doesn't automatically expand and the power is coming from an awakening knowing the body perfectly, thus him being able to burn his fire more efficiently and getting that white flame, when Luffy taps out, he is put in the body of a decrepit old man that overused the fire, so it's a weaker fire temporarily. I want to point out that we may actually never get this in-depth part of the explanation, but it's something that would remain unexplained but heavily implied. Like, remember how I said this connects back to Tom somehow? Remember what he said? Men should puff out their chest with pride and boom over the ships they build. It could be that the message Oda is getting across is that if you want to be the most powerful you can be, is that you do everything with your head held high and with your chest out. And realistically, if you look at every powerful human in One Piece, this is the form they have. From Garp, Kaido, Zoro, Whitebeard, Buccaneers, but also Akainu. And that's where a good comparison comes in with the admirals. Kuzan and Kizaru don't have the same chest puffed up look, and look at how that reflected their character arcs over One Piece, but also just within Egghead. And I have so many more theories to expand to show how versatile this line of logic can be, because the reality is this explains so much more than you can fully realize. For one thing, the emphasis on Ace's fruit being the flame fruit would make so much sense as to why Oda gave so much emphasis to that power and revived it even. And remember, Ace had multiple flame colors that he could debut, one of them being the fiery dull green fire that he had. But also Blackbeard. I have a huge Blackbeard video that all of this explanation actually fits in perfectly, but you just have to add an addendum that the way Blackbeard is able to take Whitebeard's devil fruit was because it's most likely that he pulled in Whitebeard's inner flame, which as we explained in that video would house the devil fruit as demonstrated by Brook's power. But also that unique body that Blackbeard has, it might be that the difference in his body is that he might be a hybrid of a Buccaneer, a special kind of human, because unlike others, he's able to tolerate having multiple fires within him. And maybe that's related to the Will of D, but I'll save that for another time as well, because maybe that explains why a person who eats 2 devil fruits explodes, unless they are Blackbeard or maybe even like Nika. But sticking to this video, it's also why Oda emphasized that Blackbeard can absorb fire. The way Blackbeard is able to stop someone from using their power is because, remember how I said that fire technically has weight and density? The reason why it burns upward is because it's less dense than air. If you were able to create a fire that did not require air, because of gravity, it would fall. And it's likely that when Blackbeard is touching a devil fruit user, he is able to pressure that inner flame and prevent it from moving, which, if this doesn't make too much sense, this connects to my shadows theory highlighted in the original and again in the Blackbeard video, which I'll make a full update now that this theory is out. But doesn't that sound interesting? A flame with no air? Technically, this is what a human is in the One Piece world then. And so this theoretical fire theory of an airless fire with gravity would be the situation of what happens when a devil fruit user is underwater. Remember, devil fruit weakness comes from the depth of which the user is submerged. If they are partially submerged, they still have access to oxygen. But the moment they become fully submerged, they can no longer move, because then they become that theoretical fire that just sinks due to gravity and continuously gets weakened. And if it is fire related for devil fruits, then that could explain why sea stone works. What we know is that sea stone gives off the power of the sea, and one of the strongest alternatives to this was salt that we were shown in Thriller Bark. And salt is not flammable. It's why when you have a grease fire, if you don't have a fire extinguisher, you are suggested to use baking soda or salt on the fire to quell it. It might be that Oda is using that logic here to make sea stone as effective as it is. I could keep going, but I feel like my flame is burning out. But this could explain what is happening when Zoro is in King of Hell form too. I know I'm making up that title, it's a community thing, but I think especially now it makes 100% sense. When Zoro is in the King of Hell form, all 3 of his swords have a ball of fire around them. Remember why this happened? It was because he realized there was a will in his swords, really powerful ones. The idea I think that makes sense is that as King of Hell, Zoro is able to hear the souls, battles. This goes back to the breath of all things from Alabasta. Zoro is able to hear the breath, or rather the fire that's burning in every object. And I think in his fight against King, who wears his fire on the outside and increases his durability, my belief is that Zoro is mimicking the Lunarians and pushing his blades to a higher durability state in this moment. With this logic, I think I even understand black blades better. Remember when Yukimaru said that the Shusui was forged black through Ryuma's battles? I think that Ryuma figured out how to ignite Shusui completely and forge itself using its inner fire, or maybe the fires of all the people it defeated, thus hardening it to the level of a true black blade. And before I close out, I just want to summarize and kind of finalize the context that I set forth in this video. The legendary Iron Giant was the legendary shipwright from the Void Century that built the Noah. One thing that I am debating on is if he created Pluton, or rather this shipwright's descendants did. It could be that, like Tom building the Oro Jackson, the first ship to reach Laugh-Tale, that Noah, the legendary shipwright of the past, built the Noah, but their disciple would be the parallel to Frankie that built Pluton in both timelines. But regardless, I think that the Noah through circumstances became a robot, and his mission was to guard the Noah, and for not doing this effectively is part of the reason why the legendary Iron Giant is apologizing. I don't think that the legendary Iron Giant would apologize for Pluton's creation if it's the case that they built it, because like Tom said, there's nothing good and nothing bad in building a ship. No matter what kind of ship it is, I don't care what kind of ships you build from now on, but no matter who gets injured by the ships you build, even if it looks like they'll destroy the world, you're the one who gave them life. You at least have to love them. The one who created them must not deny them. Don't blame the ships. Men should puff out their chests with pride and a boom over the ships they build. And I wanted to put the full quote out there because this sounds like a locked in quote, but I think what Oda meant by this is that ships means your creation, whatever it is, but specifically your children, biological or not. The people who have the most pride and love for their creations are the ones that last and the hardest fires to quell. Bellamir's fire lasts through Nami, Zeph's through Sanji, even Garp, who wouldn't deny his lineage even if they were a revolutionary or a pirate, which is the same with Dragon and Kuma. And Whitebeard is a great example of this as well, with Squard, Ace, and Blackbeard. And so Otahime being the embodiment of love, I think is something that was so powerful, and it exists within the Fishmen. And I think it's something that existed 200 years ago with someone who was able to show that legendary Iron Giant love, or make the Iron Giant revive itself with love. The desire to protect, and just like Kuma, sprung into action because of Bonnie, the person that he loved. And the legendary Iron Giant did the exact same thing as Kuma all the way through. And because of this parallel, I think when we find out what powers the legendary Iron Giant, we'll realize it's the same thing that is within Kuma, and it's not exclusive to just him. Everyone has it, but the ancient races of Buccaneers and Lunarians were able to more easily utilize this flame in a larger capacity. And what we'll find out is that the pinnacle of this flame that gives life to even a robot is sitting on top of Luffy's head in Gear 5. The white fire will be what the visual depiction of the undying flame that mimics the sun that the ancient kingdom harnessed. And the most important thing isn't the fire itself, it's what fuels the fire. And what I think it'll be is emotions, or in this specific case, the degrees of love. Because remember, Joy Boy was said to be the one to guide Poseidon, and the royal legend said that the power of love can save thousands when used correctly, but if used maliciously, it could sink the entire world. It is a formidable power that can be utterly destructive. Joy Boy would show Poseidon how to use the power of love correctly because they have mastered how to love life, no matter the situation, thus reaching the pinnacle of humanity, the mythical human sun god Nika, the warrior of liberation. And remember how we started this video. We are often chained by our past, unable to see a better future, and it's likely that sun god Nika is the character that unchains people from the weight of their past to become the greatest versions of themselves in the future and in the present. And I can honestly go on, and I might make more videos on this. Feel free to give me an example of a context in the One Piece world that you'd want me to explain in the comments, because I want to fit way more in, but I obviously couldn't. And if you're a longtime viewer of this channel, then you know what just happened here. One of the longest standing theories of my channel just evolved, which is essentially what happens with theories. As you get more information, you can forge them and mold them into better theories. And in that regard, Egghead has been one of the most eye-opening arcs in the entire series. And I'll link all my relevant videos like Elemental Hockey, Shadow's Theory, theory, mind rope, the Sanji theory, and way more in the description. And just know that this video is only one of many, and I have several more like this in my inner fire. Like Joy Boy promised to one day return, blessing the world with the fire of the sun, considered a guarantee on this channel. I know I've been leaving most of my viewers feeling like the legendary Iron Giant sitting in the shadows for 800 years, but one day we will sail on the ship of promise through the sea of my theories. It would mean a lot if you shared this and helped me out in the algorithm as much as you can with this one, because this theory was a long time coming, and now I can finally explain so much more, because remember, all of the theories on this channel connect. And so, like always, thank you for connecting with me, and I'm looking forward to connecting with you all on the next Parvision.